I am Donald Robertson, and I'm here in the Carnuntum Museum in Austria on the banks of the Danube, and this is where Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations. So I'm here to talk about how to think like a Roman emperor, the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, and in particular I'm going to discuss chapter 7, which is entitled Temporary Madness, and it's about coping with anger. Now, some of the anger management techniques that are most popular in modern therapy and most well established are similar to some of the techniques that we've already discussed in relation to managing desire and dealing with worry. So a simple strategy would be learning to notice the early warning signs of anger and then taking what we usually call a time out. So going away from the situation and waiting until your anger has naturally abated, and then thinking about what would be a more assertive, calm, rational way of responding, a more constructive way of responding to the situation, or engaging in some kind of rational problem solving once the feelings of anger have naturally calmed down. And the ancient philosophers were very familiar with this technique. The Pythagoreans in particular were particularly known for never acting on feelings of anger, but always going away and giving themselves time to calm down before they would respond to a situation that was making them feel angry. But in addition to that, the Stoics have a whole repertoire of techniques for anger management. And there's a section in the Meditations in Book 11, section 18, where Marcus lists 10 different anger management strategies, and he calls them gifts from Apollo. So I'm just going to briefly touch on those. It's a different approach to anger management, and these are mainly cognitive as opposed to imaginal or behavioural exercises. The things that Marcus would say to himself are questions that he would pose to himself. So the first strategy that he employs when he notices that he's beginning to become irritated or angry with other people is to remind himself that according to Stoic philosophy, we're all naturally thinking creatures and social creatures. For the Stoics, humans have a social instinct, and we're naturally inclined to form communities and to be concerned about other people. And so Marcus thinks that we have a kind of moral obligation or a duty to fulfill our potential in that regard and to do our best to interact well with other people. So he sees that as part of our nature, that we're inherently social creatures, and because we're inherently social, we have an obligation to socialise well with others. And reminding himself of that and viewing it as a duty, seeing it as something natural, helps him to find the motivation to counteract and compensate for his emerging feelings of anger. And incidentally, dealing with anger is one of the dominant themes of the Meditations. It's something that Marcus returns to time and time again, and it's no coincidence that in Book 1 he mentions the fact that as a young man he struggled not to lose his temper, and anger was a problem that he found challenging himself. So the second gift from Apollo that he mentions, the second strategy for coping with anger is that we should imagine the person that we're angry with in a more rounded and balanced way. So we should imagine a character as a whole. So rather than just focusing in on the piece of behaviour that angers us, we should think of that as just one aspect of their total life, their total personality. And when we do that, we're still aware of the thing that we're annoyed about, but it just becomes one corner of a bigger picture, and so our feelings become more balanced, more complex, more diluted, rather than just kind of putting the particular part that we find provocative under a magnifying glass. So that's bound to make us more angry if we focus in on it like a laser beam. But if we allow ourselves to see it as part of a bigger picture, if we place it in context, our feelings of anger should become more moderate. And his third strategy is a paradox that comes directly from Socrates. And he reminds himself of the Socratic teaching that no man does evil or no man does wrong knowingly or willingly. So Socrates believed that no one wants to be mistaken, no one wants to be wrong about things or to be deceived. And in particular, nobody wants to be wrong about the most important things in life, or to be morally in error, to make errors of moral judgment. So Marcus, in the Socratic tradition, reminds himself that even if people do things that are objectionable, they probably believe that what they're doing is right. Even genocidal dictators like Stalin and Hitler believed that what they were doing was justifiable or right. So even people that do the worst atrocities often don't see it the way that other people see it. They believe that they're justified. And so Marcus reminds himself of that, and that helps him to see the other person not less as just willfully malicious and more as ignorant, blind or mistaken. And so he pities them more than feeling angry with them. And the fourth strategy that he employs is to remind himself that nobody is perfect, himself included. And in particular, he says that when he becomes irritated with somebody else because of an attitude or a behaviour, he treats that as a cue or a signal to examine his own personality and to think about whether he's not perhaps guilty of some of the same things himself. And so viewing things in that way, perceiving his own flaws and recognising that he's capable of doing some of the same things that he's angry with other people for, also tends to moderate his anger. Number 5 is that he reminds himself you can never be sure of another person's motives. So when we're angry with someone, we usually have a kind of sense of certainty, an unwarranted feeling of certainty about what they're thinking and what their motives are and why they're doing certain things. Marcus actually had studied jurisprudence for many years, and he'd served as a judge in the Roman courts of law. And so he was very familiar with evaluating people's motives and character. And he says to himself, look, you can never really be certain why people are doing the things that they do. So you shouldn't jump to hasty conclusions about their motives. And that helps him also to suspend judgment and to moderate his feelings of anger. Strategy number 6 is that he reminds himself of the transience of all things. This is a very common Stoic strategy. So he reminds himself of his own mortality and also the mortality of the person that he's upset with. He sees their current behaviour as transient, and one day it'll be gone and things are going to change inevitably, and also one day they'll be dead and forgotten, and so will you. And so from that broader perspective, focusing on the temporary and transient nature of things, seeing it within the bigger picture in terms of time, it feels like it's not really worth getting all that upset about. Number 7 is the most famous Stoic strategy, but applied to anger. It comes from Epictetus. And so Marcus says, look, it's not things that upset us, but it's our judgments about them. It's not the other person's behaviour that makes me angry. It's not the things that they've said that make me angry, but rather it's my opinion and value judgments about it. If I didn't view their behaviour as offensive, then I wouldn't be offended by it. Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. So he reminds himself that it's fundamentally his own value judgments that are making him angry. If he chooses not to take offence at the other person, then he doesn't have to be hurt by the things that they say and do. And number 8 is another recurring Stoic strategy that usually goes hand in hand with the preceding one, and that's the idea that anger or negative passions in general do us more harm than the things that we're upset about. Anger, the Stoics like to say, does us more harm than the thing that we're angry about does. So rather than being kind of focused on the external and what the other person's doing, what we should really be concerned about is the way that we're responding. That's far more dangerous and toxic. Other person's behaviour at most can harm our body, our property, or our reputation perhaps, but our anger can harm our own character. And so the Stoics think that's a much, much more serious issue. So anger does us much more harm than the things that we're angry with. And remembering that turns our whole perspective on its head and can help to defuse our feelings of anger, snap out of it. Number 9, Marcus reminds himself that nature gave us certain virtues in order to cope with anger. In particular, he thinks about the Stoic virtue of kindness. So the Stoics believe that anger is the desire to take revenge on someone, to harm someone because of a perceived transgression, whereas the virtue of kindness is the desire to help someone, to educate or to improve them, to do them good. So it's the polar opposite of anger. And Marcus thinks of this as a way of counteracting anger, reminding himself that he always has the capacity to try and exercise kindness as a substitute or an alternative to anger, and one that's morally healthier and likely to work out better in the long term. So he sees it as a kind of antidote to anger. And also what goes hand in hand with that is the kind of element of role modelling. He reminds himself that other people cope with perceived offences much better by exercising virtues such as patience and tolerance and empathy and kindness. And so if Socrates or Zeno or Antoninus can exhibit these virtues in the face of provocation, then why can't he learn something from them and exhibit some of those virtues himself? Why can't he model that sort of praiseworthy behaviour? And the 10th strategy, the final one that he employs, is to remind himself that it's madness to expect other people to be perfect, and that there are good and bad people in the world. There are friendly and hostile people in the world. There are all sorts of people in the world. So the wise man, knowing that, anticipates that at some point he's likely to encounter betrayal, deception, meddling, and all of the vices in other people. It doesn't come as a shock or a surprise to him. And so Marcus says when we take away this element of shock or surprise, then our feelings tend to be less overwhelming. You know, rather than saying, I can't believe this is happening to me, if we say, well, this is bound to happen sooner or later, c'est la vie, it's to be expected. That's what people are like. It's just one of those things in life. That's what the wise man says to himself, because he looks around him and he realizes that that's what human nature is like. There are angry, mischievous, deceitful people in the world. Eventually he's bound to encounter some of them. And so Marcus readies himself, he prepares himself for that in advance, and he thinks about it very calmly and rationally, so as to take away this kind of feigned or bogus sense of surprise or astonishment or indignation that people sometimes express when they say, I can't believe someone would do that. I can't believe this guy. Marcus would say, I can totally believe it would happen, because the world is full of people that do things like that to others. I see it every day, so I shouldn't be surprised when eventually it happens to me as well. And that's his 10th and final gift from Apollo, or strategy for coping with anger. So that's a slightly different approach. As I mentioned earlier, there are more kind of behavioural techniques for coping with anger, like taking a time out and stuff. I would describe these 10 techniques as cognitive strategies, or also I'd like to call them perspective shifting exercises. So there's a whole armamentarium, a whole repertoire of different techniques. There are a surprising range that the Stoics were aware of. In fact, there's more than that. Seneca wrote an entire book that still survives today called On Anger, about the Stoic therapy for anger. But the chapter 7 in the book on temporary madness goes into that in a lot more depth, so you'll find additional information, more clarification in there as well. So let me know how you got on with experimenting with those anger management techniques. I hope that you find them helpful.